Tell you what, the money they'll spend on consultants early on is a drop in the bucket compared to change orders and change of scope and misunderstandings that occur later on.
Welcome to CMC Live. This is the show where we discuss CMC regulations and guidances simplified through real-life experiences and risk-based advice. Each episode, we speak with subject matter experts as well as other leading industry authorities. With your host, Ed Narkey.
Welcome, everyone, to the Tuesday, August 18th edition of CMC Live. I actually wanted to start by telling you guys something I learned yesterday on a long weekend vacation. I took kind of yesterday off, even though I checked my emails all day. The word talkoot. First of all, it's Finnish, if you were wondering, and I didn't turn my email off, sorry. It's Talkoot. It actually means if something has to get done, let's do it together. So again, I was thinking about the 8th edition here and how we've actually done these, and I listened to quite a number of them. So for whoever's joining us new today, maybe go back and listen to them. They're pretty exciting, and actually I'm pretty impressed, actually. So let's do it all together. So something I learned from vacation, imagine that. So Brian, I wanted you to introduce our special guest today because you actually work closely with him. And I would like to sit back and listen and ask some very good questions. So, Brian?
Today we have with us Les Mintzmyer. Les comes to us from a large molecule background, many years of experience. Les, I won't give that away. I'll let you do it. Les has been instrumental in assisting clients through the pitfalls of CMC. Part of that becomes finding CMOs and vetting CMOs. So we thought it'd be a great opportunity to have somebody with Les's background come in and speak to his approach to doing that and what may provide all of you out there some insight as you go through that process yourself. So Les, welcome.
Thank you very much, Brian. So I guess the way to kick this thing off might be to fall back on the uniformity of the issue. And that is, it really doesn't matter if the company is large, medium, small, or virtual. The path towards getting a CMO on board is pretty much the same. For those that are fortunate enough to have prior experience, it's a little bit easier because they'll have a few names in mind and know a little bit of the things that went wrong in the prior time of doing this so they can avoid those. But anyhow, the path is pretty much the same. There's a couple of key things that I think I want to bring out right away for success, and that is that whether the company has a lot of experience or zero experience, especially if it's zero experience, there's an absolute requirement to get some SMEs on board that know this, can walk the walk, talk the talk, etc. And those typically are in two camps. The CMC camp, because the reason you go to a CMO or CDMO is that you're trying to get a process moving forward. And the other is that there also should be a view towards how did this process get licensed and approved at some point. And so regulatory consultant is also very key right from the beginning. Those two consultants, or if they're hired on board, that's great too. But they need to be intimately involved in every aspect of this to be sure that the three big things, quality, cost, and time, that you can hit those as best you can on every point.
When you're talking about putting these SMEs, subject matter experts, onto a team, why? Well, I understand a CMO is supposed to be able to handle everything for you, right? That's the beauty of pushing back and letting the contract group do it. Why do we need those experts when you already have them at a CMO? I know we're in the selection process, but what's the benefit of that?
Right. So it's usually a language problem, to maybe oversimplify it. The terminology that is going to be used from CMO to CMO, some of it's going to overlap, but some of it's going to be very distinct. And also there's the regulatory language that needs to be in there. So if you're trying to write a proposal, or request for proposal rather, and you have language in there like verify a method instead of qualify or validate, those have different meanings that a regulatory person can easily suss out. A CMC expert probably can too. But, when it comes down to getting the CMO on board and actually getting what you think you're going to get, you need to have that quality check as the process moves forward to avoid the surprises. And the surprise is always costly, and it's costly in dollars, it's costly in time, hopefully not costly in quality. But that's the reason that those people really need to be on board.
Maybe for some of the audience, the CMO CDMO debate, which one is it? Maybe for me too. Can you define what CMOs are, CDMOs are? I know most folks do. However, for folks, maybe from larger companies that don't work directly with them, can you tell us about the differences, or what do they actually mean, the acronyms?
Sure. Yeah. So the CMO is Contract Manufacturing Organization. The D part brings development into it. And so if the organization also provides developmental services, then they'll usually refer to themselves as a CDMO. And it sort of depends on, what is the company looking for? What is the client looking for? Do they have a well-defined process? They just need somebody to manufacture stuff. Well, then the development portion probably is not very important. But like a lot of people that are just getting their company going, there's a fair amount of development work that has to go along with it. And so they'll be looking for a CDMO, somebody that can do development also. And that's development of process, development of methods, and the qualifications that go along with that. And so again, that harkens back to what I said initially, that you need to have SMEs in both of those camps to be sure that the work that's done in your development arena can apply and then be used to support various submission work.
So the first step in the process is really writing, as you had mentioned, an RFP, request for proposal. So how much effort is really put in? What needs to go into that to make sure you get a bid that actually makes sense and you can base decisions on?
This is really one of the cases of garbage in, garbage out. So if you put the effort into getting a very detailed and exact request for proposal written, then the CMO or CDMO that is reviewing the request can determine if they have the resources to actually accomplish the tasks that you're looking for. That allows them to propose accordingly. In some cases, they'll say, oh, you know what? We don't actually do that type of product, which is great. If they can tell you that, it's thins the crowd of CMOs you have to look through. On the other hand, they might come back and say, we do this and this and this, but we're not, we don't do this. We outsource it, and we can handle that for you, and that's fine too. But there's a need to know, what are those capabilities, and so the more detailed you can make the request for proposals, the better the resulting proposal is going to be when it comes back.
So it really is a collaborative effort with the client to get that information together.
Absolutely.
Okay. So now you've got a comprehensive RFP. You understand the product to the degree of the information you've been provided to generate the RFP. What is your initial search criteria? How do you know from the hundreds of possible vendors out there how you want to narrow this down? Because I'm sure if you hand a list of 50 to a client, it's really not much worth the paper it's printed on. And you said something early is you base it on past experience. I'm curious as to why people only remember the bad experiences and really don't highlight the good ones very often. But what criteria do you have when you select that initial group? Because obviously it gets pared down. But how do you match that up for that initial search?
A lot of the selection does come down to networking and word of mouth from other people working in the area. The nice thing about having a good network is that you can certainly weed out the ones that you don't want to be involved. So that's part of the criteria. Usually, if you need to cast a broader net, maybe you only come up with a couple of recommendations from others, then the internet is a great source to at least get some information on the various companies. Beyond that, looking at some of the regulatory history of the companies is also pretty important. If if you look somebody up and you find that they've had lots of audit problems, then that's probably not someplace you want to go to. Yeah, I don't know if that's maybe not a complete answer to your question, but most of us know half a dozen or a dozen companies that we've had some interaction with. And when you get into a group that you have a DSI, we've got a lot of other consultants that know another six or a dozen. So there's a great way to kind of bring some additional names in for consideration.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. So I think people should ask friends, colleagues, ex-colleagues, others in the industry what their experiences have been, right? Because we haven't worked with everyone individually, that is. There's some that actually show amazingly. I used to work at a manufacturing facility, and they had the team to walk everyone around, the sales team basically, and everything looked great, right? But when it comes time to go, they can't do it. So what do you think about asking friends, asking colleagues, especially if you're identifying one in particular? And then I have a follow-on question.
Okay, well, to the first part of that question, getting information from friends and colleagues, networking that way, I think that's a great way to, as I said, rule out the ones you definitely don't want. The other part of what you were saying is that frequently it is the salesperson, the BD person that's walking you around the facility, and that's not necessarily going to be a great source of information. They're going to be very careful about showing you the stuff that works, and you're not going to really know how things work on a day-to-day basis. That comes later on when you've narrowed the search, and we can maybe touch on that right now and maybe talk more later. But once you've narrowed it down to, you want at least two or three that look like they can do the job, then you need to actually get into the facility and see what's there and talk to some of the people that actually perform the work. That's important for a couple of reasons. One is that if you've audited a few of these places like I have, you can pick out the good from the bad fairly quickly. And getting to chat with some of the folks that are performing the work also, they have to pass the BS test. And that's also very helpful. But the other thing that's useful in doing that is that ultimately, when you sign a contract, you got to work collaboratively with the CMO and with the people in the CMO. And so meeting people face to face, understanding who they are, and starting to develop that rapport is going to play many, many benefits or pay back in many benefits for not only the initial search, but also ultimately when you begin to work with them.
So to take a step back, so we've gone through the RFP. When we provide that RFP, we have a CDA in place?
Of course, yeah. Yeah, because in the request, there has to be a certain amount of confidential information in order for the CMO to properly evaluate if they can do the work. So a CDA is the first thing you got to get in place with these guys.
So then the CDA is then in place with the candidates you have, and then the RFP is distributed. How important is the timing of everything that happens beyond that? Let's say, for example, how important is the timeliness of the correspondence weigh into your decision on going with that CMO? Now you've got the RFP out, distributed, the clock starts. How do you typically manage that?
Well, if you get a timely response, that tells you really some great things about the company, that they are going to be responsive. Obviously they're looking for work. So that's a good sign that they're hungry. They want to work with you. As far as managing it goes, generally you let them know, that we have a deadline of X, and all proposals we receive by that deadline will get consideration. And if you miss it, then you won't. That allows them to get something in place and get it in front of you. Every company wants everything, yesterday. And so that's also part of the quagmire you have to go through to get to a point. Younger companies without a lot of experience are going to say, well, we'll send this on Monday and we'll get responses on Friday. Well, that's not very realistic. For a RFP to be properly evaluated, it can't just come back from the BD folks, because they'll not necessarily know all the ins and outs of the capabilities. Maybe that's not fair to say, but it happens. So they need to get input from the folks that are going to be performing parts of the proposal. And so in order to do that, it's got to make its rounds to the quality organization, the manufacturing organization, and anybody else that the RFP touches. They've got to have some input on it. So that takes time. Every company is busy. I mean, that's just the way this business is. And so to get time to have a RFP distributed and make its rounds and get comments back, it's a time-consuming endeavor. So the deadline to receive stuff back, you need to be a little bit patient. It's not a week, but it's probably not more than a month, preferably less. But if you give them a month and they come back in 10 days, that's a pretty good sign that they're taking your proposal or your request seriously. If they come back at the end of the game, then well, maybe they're too busy to really perform for you. So that gives you a little bit of insight as well. One other thing that happens, which is I'll bring it up now, but it's proposals. If you get enough proposals, let's say you get a half a dozen coming in, and that's kind of like a minimum. You'd want to at least have a half a dozen to look at. What I've seen a lot of times is that proposal 1 through 5 will be X, and proposal 6 will be 2X. And it tells you a lot. It tells you that either they don't really want to do this, but they're going to put a bid in for whatever reason, probably some internal political reason. But those can be essentially discounted because nobody's going to consider when it's time and cost, and nobody's going to consider a 2X proposal against a 1X. So I've seen those. Don't know exactly the reasons for them, but I have seen it be because they don't really want the work.
That's an interesting thing you just said about half dozen at minimum. I was never shopping for CMOs. I worked at them, and then I as a regulatory person, I took data from them and judged it and used it or whatever. But Brian, actually, I have a question for you. So I was taught by somebody that says a minimum of 3, in the high, middle, and low, and maybe it was just because of the time involved and stuff like that, right? Do you have any thoughts on that minimum number? Have you ever dealt with more than 6, less than 6? Sometimes there's only one vendor, of course, right? If there's only 2 people can make it in the world, it limits you. But I'd like to hear.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. In my experience, it depends on the product. If it's a cytotoxic, it narrows the field. If there's certain nuances with your product that make it special, and yes, I realize everyone knows their product is special, but to manufacture, it may be, and it narrows that field. Typically, we try to strive for that half dozen number. It does a couple of things. It shows, one, that the request for proposal that went out was understood the same way consistently. If the numbers that come back match, if the cost is similar, but really to do any more than that, it's really work not real well spent, because you're not going to actively pursue all 6 to the very end of negotiation. Another thing is understanding actually your client's priority. If cost is their main driver, well, then now you're looking at only a portion of that list. You will have a high, low, and a midpoint, but also really how you look at those bids. Sometimes costs are not exactly very clearly put in these proposals, and you have to look at it. I know a few CMOs off the top of my head that are very big on change of scope, and that is a price increase, and they will quote you the minimum, assuming everything is right in the world, and then just continue to hit you with change of scope. So I know as much detail as you can put in it without slowing down the bidding process into that RFP, the better. Air your laundry. If it's a difficult product to manufacture, if there are very complicated methods, have that in there so there's no surprises. But I would say, to answer your question, anywhere from 4 to 6 is a good number, and then you pare it down to 2.
Yeah, you guys are great. You know how much I learn from these things every time we do them? A lot. So, but that's a great point. And it kind of just goes to show, as far as garbage in, garbage out, I guess my question is, it seems like you have to kind of pay attention to what you're asking for, almost to frame what you want to get back. Because, you can get a generic something like Brian mentioned, that cost overrides could come in, you're never even thinking about them until you get burned once or twice. So, in your experiences, is that, I guess that's something you have to have someone that's kind of used to getting bids. I know we work with a lot of folks that maybe do it once in their career, in the role that they're in, and then they move on. So can you talk to maybe some of that, as far as, some of the things that you've learned over the years, maybe some of the reading the tarot cards, I would say, you look at a proposal and, some things that you see that are alarming or that may cause, problems later.
Right. So the proposals that are returned from the companies are never one template. Companies will respond with their proposal in a variety of means. They'll have a Word document that's lots of words. They'll have an Excel spreadsheet that's got things very abbreviated with a cost associated with it. So this is actually another point where it's important to have your CMC and your regulatory person involved, because the first thing you need to do in comparing these is to get them on the same template. So that requires a lot of effort, actually, when you're trying to. I mean, as an engineer, I love an Excel spreadsheet, and so I try to take that Word document and get it into Excel so that I can do a one-on-one comparison. I can look at all the deliverables that were asked for in the request, and I can compare that against what did the company say they could do for that deliverable, what was the cost they had associated with that. So that's one of the things. The lingo that companies will use from one to the next isn't always the same. And if you're looking at CMOs that are ex-US, you have an additional problem with English not necessarily being a first language. And so now you've got to sort through, what did they mean when they said, full development? A lot has to be deciphered in that. And the back and forth has to begin right there. So having a contact person at each of the CMOs and having a SME that understands what they're asking and what they're going to receive is very important. So there's a lot of communication back and forth with each of these CMOs in that process to make sure that everything is understood properly. I mentioned earlier the verification, qualification, validation. And that is pretty key to make sure that that's well understood. You don't want to be midway through your process and think that you were going to get validation activity when in fact they're just verifying a few compendial methods. So that needs to be sorted out.
I think the term development is one that it's a rather broad term, and I think when a CMO says I support development, immediately your attention turns to how. Have you done it before? Do you have a pilot scale? Do you, show me the capabilities of your development lab? I think that's where, to your point earlier, Les, having a qualified subject matter expert looking at the bids, there may be follow-up questions based on what they propose to you. So that, I think, is the benefit to the point you raised earlier about putting that team together with the endpoint in mind to make sure the CMO that you then sign with and trust for further down the road has been fully vetted.
Right. Yeah. And just to put another point on that companies are, especially the startup companies, very dollar conscious, and it's good that they are. Who doesn't want a good deal? They may be a little reluctant to spend consultant money on that early stage, but I tell you what, the money they'll spend on consultants early on is a drop in the bucket compared to change orders and change of scope and misunderstandings that occur later on. There needs to be built into the proposal a contingency too. So as long as the proposal appears to be well done, well proposed, and it passes muster with the CMC and the regulatory, then I'm comfortable usually telling the client that add 25% for the stuff that you didn't think about, don't know about, and it's going to pop up. That number is pretty good, but it can be a heck of a lot more than that if the proposal isn't well vetted. It's easy for that 1x to become 50%, 75% more with change orders and repeats of things that went awry.
Yeah, this is kind of uncanny because I wrote some questions down, and somehow you must have received them, Les, because you've answered all of them so far. And there's actually one I'm waiting for you to answer, and if you do it, you're going to be 4 for 4. But I want to go back. You talked about the language barrier. I guess how that should be considered. Most European CMOs have PMs who speak probably really great English. Actually, from everyone I met, most of the legit ones have that. Asian maybe not so much. Could that be a an issue that comes up as far as the language. I know you mentioned it, but is that something that you would really do want to consider when you're selecting a CMO?
Well, not language so much. We can talk about that in a second, but the thing that jumped out at me when you're asking this question is how difficult is it going to be to communicate and collaborate with the CMO that you choose? If you're in the US and you're looking at Europe, you got at least 6 hours time difference. That's not insurmountable, but it does pose some additional potential delays by the time you receive information, get it through the network locally, and then try to get back. Usually a day is lost before you can get things to happen. If you're looking at a CMO that's 10, 11, 12 hours time difference, that becomes very problematic. Somebody's got to get up very early or stay up very late in order to keep that communication going. And the collaboration with these companies is paramount in getting the result that you want at the cost and time that you are hoping for. Let's talk about the language a little bit. That's what you actually asked. Although the BD and the PMs in these companies speak pretty good English, a couple of things I've found. One is that you may be their only English-speaking client, and if that's the case, then their English kind of comes and goes. As you know, in Europe, they have a hiatus for vacation into the summer, and I've noticed when we get back on the communication that their English kind of needs to be sharpened up again. So that's not a big deal, but you have to be listening really carefully to not mistake what's being said. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is culture. We've had some experiences where things were promised because it's sort of saving face to promise, but then they don't get delivered. And so you also have to be kind of aware of, if you're going to be asking for something to be delivered, make sure that it's not an ask that is going to take the person out of their ability to deliver it. So I don't know how to describe that any closer, I don't think.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the other question was literally, Les, ask less about time zones and if they become a hassle. East Coast to Europe is pretty easy. California gets a little harder. Asia, we've all had those calls. So, you just mentioned it, of course, right? Time zones. And I kind of want to, it's a bland question. So I wanted to kind of expand it for where we're at, in modern times here. COVID-19, travel and those things they seem to have changed. So one thing I'll ask as addition now, how far are you willing to travel to visit your CMOs? And second part of that and piece of it is, are you okay never visiting it?
Well, that's a heck of a question. In normal times, I would insist that a visit happen because, as I said earlier, you got to get in there to see what the facility really is capable of delivering and what the people are capable of delivering and to form that relationship. With COVID, that has become next to impossible. The best we can do is to rely on our network and hope that we get good advice from our colleagues. One thing that we've tried is virtual auditing. I need to see more of that to see how effective that can be. You can tell a lot about an organization if they'll let you take a look at their regulatory history, for instance, and look at their maintenance history. Those are two real key things. And also the deviations. If you find that there's lots and lots of deviations associated with environmental problems, well, you probably don't want to put your biologic into a facility that's having mold and bacterial hits right and left. If you are looking at, again, at deviations that have maintenance issues, well, that's really a heck of a smoking gun, too, that suggests maybe the company is scrimping on keeping equipment properly maintained. That's going to bite you big time if you've got a few $100,000 worth of run going and their equipment breaks down. There better be provision in the contract about who's going to be responsible for that. So those are things that can happen. You can sort out some of those, problem areas if you can get access to some of the documentation in those facilities. I mentioned regulatory audits and stuff too. That's always a good place to look, just to whether you're weeding them out at the beginning or if you're now having to make a decision based on not being able to go to the facility. With webcasts and stuff, you've got some opportunity to interface. It's not being there, but it's at least something.
Do you encourage the team that's involved in the CMO selection process to also be involved in the product transfer process? Or really are these two completely separate functions and you could just turnkey somebody else jump in and transfer the product?
Well, there's handoffs that can happen. So it's not impossible to move from person A to B as long as they have a similar skill set. For continuity, though, if you can maintain the same relationship with the same SMEs from start to finish, you're going to have a lot less surprises. They will have vetted the proposal in the first place. They'll be there for the tech transfer, the kickoff, probably be there for the for at least some of the work that gets done. So my recommendation would be to keep those people in place so that you don't have a different opinion. Yeah, I guess that's I have I guess I have some sores from people that don't necessarily, they might have the same skill set, but they'll have a different approach to how they're interpreting maybe what they're seeing, and that can be a real problem if a company's running down the path thinking they've got everything covered, and then you got somebody come in that came from a little different place, and it can cause you cost, and it costs time, it costs money. Potentially, and you have to build a new relationship, then with the people you're interacting with too. So
that's a very friendly way to put that. But I'd like to back up a bit, if I may. Can you give a little bit of an overview of your experience in industry? And we spent all this time talking about CMO, CDMO selection, and based on your experience, could you perhaps maybe talk a little bit about where you've been and what you've done?
Sure. So I mentioned everything from large, medium, small, and startup companies. I've worked for all of those. I've also been involved with auditing as well as CMO selection. And I was the VP of manufacturing at 2 CMOs. And so those places I was on the proposal side of the equation. And so I can tell you, it has to make the rounds in order to be a good proposal. And the BD people always promise more than you can just fall off your chair and deliver. It's sometimes a very creative process to figure out how you're gonna be able to get the job done for the client. But anyway, it's fun. So yeah, so I've been involved with proposal writing, proposal reviewing, requests for proposals. I've been person in the plant in a couple of CMOs for different clients, and kind of seen it, done it.
I can hear it as well. Working in the manufacturing facility, when you go over and become part of a small biotech or maybe a larger company that's using CMOs, you definitely have a different view versus if you were just at that biotech right out of school or right out of another piece, not working in manufacturing. You definitely see it from both ways. So I think it's very helpful, and it sounds like you have great experiences in those things. So I wanted to recap, though. I think there was a couple things that I forgot about, actually. So we talked about observations by regulatory agencies, a history. That's certainly a large portion of selecting them. We didn't get into some of the quality systems, and that's more of a QA topic, I think. Personal interaction. We kind of hit on a few things here, especially in these new times, right? Getting there and actually being there in person, examining the facilities. That's kind of part and parcel of the same thing. And the technology capacity. It really depends on your product. There's two types of CMOs in my mind: the ones that make the active, the API manufacturers, And that's where I came from, very low margins in most cases. Biologics, not so much, but the drug product is very different, I think, in my mind, just because they do different thing there. One thing that we didn't talk about, and I open this up to Brian and maybe Miranda, maybe you've heard people talk about this, in just some of our lead calls over the years. Capacity. There's different vendors, different CMOs for different purposes. And one may be suited well for one type of company at a certain stage, and it may be totally the wrong fit for another one. Doesn't mean they're bad. Can you talk about capacity and in the framework of there's very large CROs out there that market all over the place, and people go by the name, and there's small ones, that might actually be more accommodating for smaller emerging biotech. However, take the good with the bad, you have to look at everything. So, Les, maybe you can start. Can you talk about maybe capacity and sense of selecting a CMO and how that might work or things to look for?
Sure. So the capacity part of it generally will sort itself out when you're in the request for proposal stage. If you have a product that's always going to be a 1,000-liter product, and that's the proposed commercial batch size based on usually some initial marketing study. A outfit that does 20,000 liter, and that's kind of what they do, isn't going to propose. So they're going to sort of sort themselves out of the equation. Capacity actually means a couple of different things to me. One is the equipment sizing, which I think is where you're coming from right now. But the other is the capacity of the facility to actually get the work done. Most CMOs want to be around 70 to 80% at capacity, and a lot of them struggle to be there.
What I was thinking as far as capacity, I was thinking like in case of an upset in manufacturing, for example, that happens frequently, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your manufacturing date could get postponed, and that could mean a couple different things. It's bad if you're making it for a specific time period to dose, a study, run a trial. But really, it's more so if it's a milestone. You're planning a validation, or you're planning for a launch, or when you get approval, like seasonal distribution if you're running short on material. So if you miss the date, in that instance, the latter part, you lose market share, you lose money, right? But these things happen during development too, as we all know, for different reasons. So that's the question, I guess, about the capacity. I've worked at one large CMO, name shall go unnamed, but you can find it on my LinkedIn page. They were just always at 100%. And when things happen, people got pushed aside. Small companies weren't able to, that were delayed and those things like that. That's the terms I was talking about when you're looking into a facility. Should you be scared that they're only at half capacity? Does that send a message that they do a bad job maybe? Or is it just that they actually know how to plan better and they're probably more appropriate?
Okay, I think I understand your question better now. So I guess I'll address it in a couple of ways. A CMO may have excess capacity because they're newcomers into the field. Some companies actually, think it's a good idea to create that capability at some point of the company. If that's the case, then it does take a while to build up a client base. Also, as products move in and out, sometimes capacity arrives because some larger volume product maybe has gone off of patent, and it's not going to be produced in the same kind of quantity. So that could cause extra capacity to be available. As far as the 100% at 100% capacity, I tell you, when stuff like that, when you have a problem, sometimes they'll have a client that has a pretty large inventory, and so they can approach that client and say, "Hey, we had you scheduled for November, but how about if we move you to January? Does that cause a problem?" And so, kind of comes down to what I was saying before about relationship with the CMO. If you have a good relationship and things will happen, they will probably be more likely to work with you to resolve those if you have a good relationship. If you don't, then they would be maybe less inclined to go to one of their established clients and ask them to move. So it can be a problem, but most of the CMOs they're not working at 100% capacity. They've got, like I said, if they can get 70 or 80, they're pretty happy. So I've only seen that in one instance where we had to go and be very, on our knees asking if, can we get into this time slot somehow? And
Right. Yeah. Okay. So just another thing to consider, I would say. Miranda, any questions from your angle? I know you asked me these questions about CMO selections, and I can't really tell you. I make stuff up maybe sometimes, but any inquiries that you've heard or any questions that you might just have from listening to Les today?
Most of them have been answered, but a lot of the things that come to us from prospective clients is they'll say, is this CMO good? And there can be times where we'll be on a call and we'll be like, I might need a little bit more information. So I guess it depends on what the CMO is looking for, but I've had prospective clients come to me and tell me what CMO they're going to be using under CDA. And we've asked those prospective clients if they've had multiple bids and requests for proposals. And they said, no, this is a very good CMO. We don't need one. What would be your advice to somebody in that predicament where maybe they have a consultant, maybe somebody onboarded into the company is very comfortable with a particular CMO? What do they lose for not looking elsewhere?
And Les, before you answer, if I can add on to that, because that's a good question. This is part of it, but I think, and maybe second half of it, I see people who just don't know about the CMOs and they put too much emphasis on a name, right? There's a couple of very large API and drug product folks out there that say they can do everything, and they'll tell you this, right? So the second part of the question, I guess, is the name is should you put a lot of emphasis into a name, or does that lead you down the wrong road?
Yes. Indeed, there are a lot of good CMOs out there, and they've got their name brand is fairly well known. There's not necessarily anything wrong with going in that direction, but what I was kind of began this with is that the startup companies, especially, they're looking for time and cost primarily. Quality is in there too, but going with the name brand company is not necessarily going to get them either time or cost. It's important to have those other CMOs vetted as well through the RFP process to see where the value lies. Being able to work with, I kept coming back to this, that being able to work with the CMO is paramount to success. And so, it's not that you can't work with a large CMO, you certainly can, but if you're a bigger part of the CMO's business, you're going to get a little bit more attention than you may if you're going with a larger CMO. So no, don't. The short answer is you got to go through the RFP process in order to be sure that you're getting the best value. It's money's always going to be a problem, and so to shortcut that process is really setting yourself up for some heartache down the road.
Well, I assume and presume we could talk for a couple more hours. I realize how naive I am about CMO selections. It's been a while since I worked on them, but I think this was a great start. Les, any other questions right now, Miranda?
No, but I look forward to having you back on a future podcast about biologics.
Les, yes, that's a good point. And for folks that can't see the screen here, we have a name for Les. It's called, I have to go back to the screen here and see it actually. He calls himself the Adventurous Engineer, and there's a space. It's not all one word. And that's a great title. It kind of reminds me now of Les. But we have a new name for you at DSI. And it's I'm going to start calling you this, so prepare yourself. Your name is now Super Les. Okay? Super Les. It flows perfectly like Super Dave. Remember Super Dave? I'm going to hear you now. Last name, I'm going to just think Super Les. So once again, thanks a lot, Les Mintzmyer. Perfect. Great story here. I think this will benefit folks, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for listening. To read the full show notes for this episode, which include a summary, timestamps, and any links mentioned in this episode, please visit dsinformatics.com/podcast. There you'll find the information from this episode and any past episodes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/CMC Live. We'll be sure to read these out on future episodes.